This episode contains discussion of real-world violence, including murder and assault. It is explored with care, but some listeners may find it difficult. Please take care whilst listening. By the time Peter Sutcliffe was finally arrested, his name had already appeared within the Yorkshire Ripper investigation more than once. His vehicle had attracted attention. He had been interviewed by police. Witness descriptions had occasionally drifted close to him. Information connected to him existed within the investigation long before his eventual arrest. Looking back now, those facts can feel almost impossible to reconcile with what followed. If Peter Sutcliffe repeatedly crossed paths with the investigation, why didn't those encounters change its direction? Why did opportunities that appear significant today fail to alter the course of one of the largest murder inquiries in British history? The answer does not lie in a single mistake, nor does it lie in a single decision. Instead, it emerges through years of pressure, uncertainty, fear, and an increasingly powerful need to make sense of a case that had already reshaped communities across Yorkshire. Because finding evidence and understanding evidence are not always the same thing. And sometimes the greatest challenge facing an investigation is not discovering information. It is deciding what that information means. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have your company. I'm Jenny. I love history, and I am fascinated by the moments where human psychology collides with it in the worst possible ways. This is Hidden Chronicles, Season 3, The Yorkshire Ripper, Episode 12, The Picture They Couldn't See. By the late 1970s, the Yorkshire Ripper investigation had become one of the largest and most demanding murder inquiries that Britain had ever seen. Thousands of statements had been collected. Thousands of names had been recorded. Officers from multiple police forces had become involved. Every attack generated new leads, new witness accounts, and new possibilities. Yet despite the enormous scale of the inquiry, the killer remained unidentified. That failure carried consequences far beyond police stations and investigation rooms. Families continued grieving loved ones already lost to violence. Women continued adjusting daily routines around fears that the attacks might happen again. Communities across Yorkshire had spent years living alongside uncertainty. And uncertainty is rarely a passive experience. It changes behaviour. It influences decisions. It reshapes how people move through ordinary life. For investigators, the pressure must have been immense. Every new attack represented not only another crime scene, but another reminder that years of investigative effort had still not produced the answer everybody desperately wanted. The man responsible remained unknown. and unknown is a difficult thing for human beings to tolerate. Psychologically, uncertainty creates strain. Human beings naturally seek patterns, explanations, and meaning. We want events to make sense. We want information to fit together. We want complexity to become understandable. For detectives working the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry, that need was not simply emotional. It was practical. An investigation cannot remain a collection of disconnected facts forever. At some point, detectives must begin deciding which leads appear most promising, which explanations seem most convincing, and which direction deserves the greatest attention. In other words, they must begin constructing a way of understanding what they are seeing. That process was neither unusual nor misguided. Every major investigation does it. Detectives examine crime scenes, compare witness accounts, analyse patterns, and search for details capable of revealing something about the offender responsible. Without some form of working explanation, it becomes almost impossible to navigate the overwhelming volume of information generated by such a large inquiry. And the Yorkshire Ripper investigation had reached precisely that point. It was no longer struggling to find information. It was struggling to understand it. Thousands of pieces of evidence existed within the inquiry. Some would eventually prove significant. Many would not. The challenge facing detectives was determining which details deserved greater attention and which did not. That challenge became increasingly difficult as the investigation expanded. Because information by itself rarely tells investigators what it means. Meaning must be constructed. Connections must be recognised. Interpretations must be made. And once investigators begin building those interpretations, something important starts to happen. The evidence remains the same. But the way the evidence is understood begins to change. And by the late 1970s, that process was becoming increasingly important to the direction of the Yorkshire Ripper investigation. As the investigation entered its later years, detectives faced an increasingly difficult problem. The inquiry continued generating information. Every attack produced new witness accounts. New vehicle registrations were examined. New names entered police records. Fresh intelligence arrived from members of the public, neighbouring police forces, and journalists following developments closely. Yet despite the growing volume of information, the identity of the killer remained unknown. For investigators, this created a challenge that went beyond simply collecting evidence. They needed to understand what they were looking at. Who was the man responsible? What connected the attacks? What patterns existed beneath the violence? And what could those patterns reveal about the offender himself? These questions mattered because every answer carried practical consequences. Detectives could not investigate every lead with equal intensity forever. Decisions had to be made. Resources had to be directed. Priorities had to be established. Gradually, investigators began constructing an understanding of the offender they believed that they were searching for. Not a name, not a face, an explanation. A way of organising years of evidence into something that felt coherent. This was not unusual. Every major investigation attempts something similar. When an offender remains unidentified, detectives search not only for clues, but for meaning. They compare offences. They examine behaviour. They look for patterns capable of revealing something about the individual responsible. Psychologically, this reflects a very human response to complexity. When confronted with overwhelming amounts of information, people naturally begin organising that information into explanations. Those explanations help to reduce uncertainty. They create direction. They make decision-making possible. Most of the time, that process is necessary. Without it, investigations become overwhelmed by competing possibilities. Yet every explanation carries a risk. Because once people begin feeling that they understand something, that understanding can gradually become influential in ways they do not immediately recognise. New information is no longer assessed entirely on its own. Instead, it begins being compared against the explanation already taking shape. At first, that influence remained subtle. The investigation was still pursuing leads, still collecting information, still exploring possibilities. Nothing dramatic had changed. Yet beneath the surface, expectations were beginning to develop. And expectations have a remarkable ability to shape what human beings notice, what they prioritise, and what they believe. The more persuasive an explanation becomes, the more influence it can begin exerting over the interpretation of new information. That does not mean investigators stop following evidence. Far from it. The evidence remains central. The difficulty is that evidence is never interpreted in complete isolation. It is understood through the assumptions, expectations, and beliefs that people already possess. Within the Yorkshire Ripper investigation, that process was becoming increasingly important. Because the question detectives were asking was slowly beginning to change. No longer simply, who is the killer? But increasingly, Who fits the understanding of the killer we have begun to develop? At first glance, those questions may appear almost identical. Over time, however, the difference between them can become enormously important. And as the investigation continued, that difference would begin shaping far more than anyone realised. As the investigation continued, the explanation detectives were constructing remained exactly that: an explanation. A working understanding of the offender based upon the evidence available at the time. Like all working theories, it remained vulnerable to change. New information could still reshape it. New evidence could still challenge it. New developments could still alter its direction. And then in 1978, the investigation received communication from somebody claiming to be the Yorkshire Ripper. The letters attracted attention. The tape attracted even more. Today, the Wearside communications are remembered as one of the most damaging developments in the entire investigation. Yet understanding their influence requires us to place ourselves inside the inquiry as it existed at the time. Detectives were not examining the letters and tape with the benefit of hindsight. They were examining them whilst attempting to solve a series of murders that had already spanned years. Women had lost their lives. Women had been attacked, and brutally so. Communities remained fearful. Public pressure continued to grow. And despite enormous investigative effort, the killer remained unidentified. Under those circumstances, the possibility that the offender had finally revealed something about himself could not simply be dismissed. The communications were analysed. Experts became involved. Questions were asked about authenticity. Questions were asked about credibility. Gradually, confidence in the communication began to grow. The significance of that confidence extended far beyond the letters themselves. Because the letters and tape appeared to do something psychologically powerful. They appeared to confirm an explanation that investigators were already building. This is one of the reasons confirmation bias can be so difficult to recognise whilst it is happening. Popular discussions sometimes portray confirmation bias as people deliberately ignoring evidence that contradicts their beliefs. Reality is usually far more complicated. More often, confirmation bias emerges when information appears to support an explanation that already feels persuasive. The supporting information feels convincing. The explanation feels stronger. And confidence grows. Importantly, none of this requires dishonesty, nor does it require incompetence. In fact, it often happens precisely because people are trying to make sense of complex situations using the information that is available to them. For investigators working the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry, the letters and tape appeared to provide something they had been searching for over many years. Direction. The offender no longer seemed quite so unknown, quite so distant, quite so difficult to imagine. Instead, investigators appeared to possess something far more tangible: a voice, a personality, a man who seemed to be speaking directly from within the investigation itself. Psychologically, certainty carries enormous appeal during periods of prolonged uncertainty. Uncertainty is exhausting. It demands constant reassessment, constant doubt, constant vigilance. Certainty offers relief. It offers the reassuring possibility that events are finally beginning to make sense. The difficulty, however, is that certainty can become attractive even when it is misplaced. And once certainty begins attaching itself to a particular explanation, alternative explanations often become harder to recognize. Not because they disappear, but because they increasingly compete against something that already feels true. Nothing about that process is unique to this investigation. It reflects a tendency that exists throughout human decision-making. The more persuasive an explanation becomes, the harder it can be to imagine that the explanation itself may be wrong. Within the Yorkshire Ripper investigation, that process would become increasingly significant. Because whilst confidence in the emerging understanding of the offender continued growing, reality was becoming far more complicated. And reality has a habit of creating problems for explanations that become too comfortable. This brings us back to Peter Sutcliffe. And perhaps more importantly, it brings us back to the question left behind by the previous episode. If Peter Sutcliffe repeatedly crossed paths with the investigation, why did those encounters fail to change its direction? At first glance, the answer can seem difficult to understand. The opportunities were real. The inquiries were real. The information was real. Looking backwards from the perspective of his eventual arrest, it can feel as though the investigation repeatedly brushed against the truth, without ever fully recognizing it. Yet that impression is shaped by something investigators at the time did not possess: the completed story. Today, we can place Jean Jordan alongside the £5 note inquiry. We can place the interviews alongside the vehicle information. We can place Marilyn Moore's survival alongside everything that followed. We know how those events connect because history has already revealed the ending. It is of great importance that we recognise that the investigators had no such advantage. For them, these events did not arrive together. They emerged across different stages of the inquiry, under different circumstances, and often within entirely different investigative context. What appears to us as a single narrative appeared to them as separate pieces of information, arriving not all at once, but over a period of years. And that distinction matters enormously, because information does not become meaningful simply because it exists. It becomes meaningful when human beings recognize the significance of the connections between it. Psychologically, hindsight often creates the illusion that those connections were obvious all along. In reality, most historical events appear far clearer after they have happened than they did whilst they were unfolding. Once we know the ending, our brains naturally begin organising earlier events around it. The clues seem clearer. The opportunities seem larger. The mistakes seem easier to identify. The uncertainty that existed at the time begins to disappear. But uncertainty was exactly what investigators were living with. Every day brought new information. Every week generated new possibilities. Every lead had to compete with countless others for time, resources, and attention. And by now, those decisions were increasingly being made within the framework of an explanation that had developed over many years. This is where the encounters with Peter Sutcliffe become particularly important, because none of them, viewed individually, necessarily demanded a complete change in investigative direction. Each encounter raised questions. Each encounter justified further inquiry. Each encounter created opportunity. Yet viewed in isolation, they remained fragments. The significance we attach to them today comes largely from the fact that we already know how they fit together. But remember, investigators did not. Instead, they encountered separate pieces of information that needed to be interpreted within an investigation already overwhelmed with complexity. And interpretation was becoming increasingly influenced by what detectives believed that they understood about the offender that they were seeking. The question, therefore, is not really why did investigators see Peter Sutcliffe? They did. The more important question is why did seeing Peter Sutcliffe fail to change what they believed? And by now we can begin to see the answer. Because changing what investigators believed required far more than identifying any suspect or pursuing any lead. It required challenging an explanation that had become increasingly persuasive over time. An explanation supported by years of investigative effort. An explanation strengthened by assumptions that appeared reasonable at the time. An explanation reinforced by information that seemed to confirm it. And once that explanation became embedded deeply enough within the investigation, individual contradictions became harder to interpret as signs that the explanation itself might require revision. Not impossible, but harder, much harder. Peter Sutcliffe remained inside the investigation. The opportunities connected to him remained inside the investigation. The questions surrounding him remained inside the investigation. What had changed was not the evidence. What had changed was the way the evidence was being understood. And as the gap between evidence and interpretation continued widening, the investigation found itself confronting a difficult reality. The closer detectives believed that they were getting to understanding the offender, the further they were drifting from the man that they were actually seeking. Looking back now, it can be tempting to search for a single turning point, a single decision, a single mistake, a single moment when the investigation somehow lost sight of the truth. History rarely works that way. The Yorkshire Ripper investigation did not arrive at this position because one detective overlooked one clue, or because one decision suddenly changed everything. Instead, it arrived here through a process shaped by uncertainty, by pressure, by fear, by the practical realities of investigating a series of murders that had already spanned years. The investigation needed explanations. It needed priorities. It needed a way of making sense of overwhelming amounts of information. In many respects, those needs were entirely reasonable. Without them, the inquiry could not have functioned. Yet the same psychological processes that help human beings navigate complexity can sometimes make complexity harder to recognize. The same explanations that provide direction can become difficult to challenge. The same assumptions that help organize information can influence how that information is interpreted. And over time, those influences can become remarkably powerful. That is one of the most important lessons of the Yorkshire Ripper investigation. Not simply that evidence matters, but that the interpretation of evidence matters too. Because evidence never speaks entirely for itself. Human beings give it meaning. Human beings decide which connections appear significant. Human beings determine which explanations feel persuasive. And sometimes, despite the best efforts of everybody involved, those explanations can begin to drift away from reality. By the late 1970s, Peter Sutcliffe remained inside the investigation. The opportunities connected to him remained inside the investigation. The evidence connected to him remained inside the investigation. What had changed was not the existence of those opportunities. What had changed was the framework through which they were being understood. The problem was not that investigators never encountered Peter Sutcliffe. The problem was that they did. And the more persuasive their understanding of the offender became, the harder it became for those encounters to alter the direction of the inquiry. Yet throughout all of this, it is important to remember who paid the highest price. Women lost their lives. Families lost daughters, sisters, mothers, partners, and friends. A grief that is so unimaginable to those of us untouched. Communities spent years living alongside fear, uncertainty, and grief. The consequences of investigative decisions were never abstract. They were measured in human lives, human suffering, human loss. And that reality should remain at the centre of the story. not the theories, not any mistakes that could have been made, and not even the investigation itself. The people whose lives were taken, the people who were seriously injured, and the people left behind to live with what followed. In the next episode, we continue following the Yorkshire Ripper investigation, as growing contradictions, mounting pressure, and an increasingly complicated reality place even greater strain upon the explanation detectives have built. The gap between belief and evidence continues to widen, and as the first serious cracks begin appearing in the picture, investigators have spent years constructing. Thank you for listening. I'm really glad you joined me. If you're enjoying Hidden Chronicles, be sure to follow so that you don't miss what comes next. And if you have a moment, a rating on Spotify or Audible really does help more people discover this podcast. As always, take care and be gentle with what history leaves behind.